everybody. Today we're covering chapter 13. We're covering lesson 12, which is all on bureaucracy. A really enticing chapter. It's something that we've covered throughout the semester. We've mentioned a lot of bureaucratic structures, but this chapter is devoted just to understanding actual bureaucracy. It's something we encounter every day whenever we encounter something that has to do with the government. Everything from the post office to the DMV. They're all bureaucratic structures. So it's a really good thing, if you get anything out of this class, that you understand a little bit about bureaucracy. Now, to start off with bureaucracy, it hasn't always been as big and extensive and all-knowing as we see it today. Bureaucracy prior to the Civil War was actually pretty small. And the thing is, it was only made up of a select few people. They were prominent gentlemen, so they were in that same pool that could have been politicians. So wealthy, well-educated, and white land-owning gentlemen were typically the ones who ended up in the bureaucracy. Originally, early in the bureaucratic structure, the people who were chosen from that small pool to be in the bureaucratic structure were chosen based on competence. When we start seeing Andrew Jackson come along, that we see bureaucrats being chosen more along partisan lines to fill those spaces. It's something that's shifted back and forth. Our government, though, has become increasingly partisan based, so it would make sense that our bureaucratic structures did as well. If you move on to the next slide, you're going to see just a small little tidbit of our bureaucratic structure, and this includes our cabinet departments. The president's at the very top, going down to one of our newest cabinets, which is the department of our newest departments, which is the Department of Homeland Security, one of the newest bureaucratic structures that's been developed. Now, following the Civil War, the bureaucratic structure got way bigger. We see this happen whenever there's more involvement from the government. So if you look at the era of FDR and New Deal legislation, government took a much bigger role in our everyday lives, and therefore we ended up with an expansion of the responsibility and involvement of the bureaucracy. So everything got way bigger. Party loyalty has, again, remained the basis of decision making when it comes to our bureaucrats. In 1883, we established something called the Pendleton Act. This reduced the number of political appointments that the president could make and created a more professional civil service. We've noticed throughout the semester that whenever the president does anything, most of the time, 99% of the time, he can't just do it on his own anymore. It needs to be something that gets confirmed by, say, the Senate. And so a lot of bureaucratic appointments that we see nowadays are maybe put forth and nominated by the president, but they need to be confirmed by another department. It's put it into more of a category of a business rather than a partisan or political establishment. So it's made our bureaucracy a little more neutral. Moving on, today's federal bureaucracy emphasizes professionalism and treating the public as consumers rather than treating them as, children or as an inherited or governed citizen. The parties still do use bureaucracy a lot to advance their partisan party line and their interests. If you think about it this way, interest groups are typically politically affiliated, and they get involved in the bureaucracy. If you think about the Environmental Protection Agency, there are interest groups who get involved with them. They're partisan. They are still going to influence the legislation and how policy is carried out with the EPA. So we still do see a lot of political influence, even though we've tried to make it a little more neutral when it comes to people getting nominated or taking places in those bureaucracies. When we talk about new patronage, this is when we advance specific policies by influencing priorities and activities of our bureaucracy. So it could be anything from advancing a policy and making sure it gets seen now versus seen in a year, like moving things up in timetable, to any number of things that influence the bureaucracy. That's something that we can take part of when we're talking about bureaucracy, we can get involved in the policy-making process. So when I talk about policy a little bit down the road, that's something to consider. Policy is something that's initiated by bureaucracy. Reinventing government initiative is aimed at running government like a business with citizens as consumers. It helps with the efficacy of government. When we run something as a business, we tend to make it even more efficient, and when it's more customer oriented, it makes people happier. So when we talk about the nature of bureaucracy, there are three main traits that contribute to our bureaucratic principles. One is hierarchical authority. You have an employee, you have their boss, their boss, their boss, and so on and so forth. There's a hierarchy. There's also formal rules, as well as a clear and distinct division of labor. This includes really clear tasks and responsibilities that are set forth for any given bureaucracy. It means that the productions of goods and services is at increased efficiency. It also means that decision making is quick and unbiased. This is something that we've kind of found causes problems every once in a while. If you think back to week one of the videos we watched dealt with an issue with immigration services. Now, if there's blanket policies that are supposed to encompass everyone, but there's an exception to the rule, bureaucracy isn't very flexible. It doesn't allow for those exceptions to the rules very often. And so that's kind of the downfall that we see in some of our bureaucracy. But the thing is, bureaucracy has to focus on being the best thing for everyone. So those few exceptions we can't really help. The principles that enhance efficiency and equal treatment can sometimes make this inflexibility and this unresponsiveness that we see in cases like the INS. But there's only so much we can do about it. And again, we can take it upon ourselves as citizens to get active and say that there needs to be a change in a policy because there's been a change in time in what happens with our time. So it is up to us as citizens to take advantage of the process of our government and change bureaucracy if we need, or if we see the need to do so. When we look at the nature of bureaucracy, again, bureaucratic pathologies, you're going to see this term a couple times throughout your book. This is when an organization fails to serve its intended purpose. Sometimes this could mean bureaucratic imperialism, failure to adapt to changing times and technologies. It's very important with internet coming up. Neglecting legitimate citizen concerns. So if we do speak up and if we have interest and we approach bureaucratic structures and they don't change, that can contribute to their failure. And favoritism also. So that's why they can't be overly partisan anymore, because if they show too much favoritism, those bureaucratic structures may not survive. So when we talk about federal bureaucrats and their work, they can either be political appointees or they can be career civil servants. It can be from either. Political appointees are typically chosen by the president, and they're going to be confirmed, again, by the Senate. The president can't act alone anymore when it comes to that. Most federal bureaucracies or bureaucrats are hired under civil servant positions, and they tend to be lifetime appointments as well. Bureaucrats perform professional, managerial, technical, service, and clerical tasks, all kinds of things. Like I said, everything from the DMV to the post office. To ensure nonpartisan civil service, it is very difficult to fire a bureaucrat once they've been put into office for any reason. That means that once the president changes and if a different party takes over, they can't just reappoint the head of the EPA because they feel like it. It's very difficult. It's kind of like having tenure in a position. You have to do something really, really bad to get taken out of that position. And if you think about it, when the Senate confirms a position in the bureaucracy, that's bipartisan support. So it's even less likely that somebody could get fired just because they're not the right party supporter. The bureaucracy does some of the work that transforms laws into specific programs, where again, when we talk about policy, we're going to see how much the bureaucracy plays a part in developing policy. If you think about it, whenever a legislation is put through, There has to be ways to make it happen. It just doesn't magically appear and happen and work out just fine. There has to be policy created for that legislation in order to carry it out in a practical way for the people. And the bureaucratic structures are one of our primary liaisons when it comes to making policy that's going to work and effectively, say, use our tax dollars. The bureaucracy makes the rules that specify how to interpret and carry out policy. Um, Again, rulemaking is a really public process. Citizens can comment on proposed rules. They can send in ideas and addendums. We can get involved with the uh, bureaucratic process. A lot of agencies actually invite interest groups who specialize in the policy area to help write the rules and process. It's called negotiated rulemaking. Agencies can compel compliance with rules through a process called administrative adjudication, something you're going to encounter again a few times within your book. The federal bureaucratic structures are organized into 6 major sections. When we talk about government corporations, they're businesses established by the government and specifically Congress to make certain service affordable for average citizens. So government corporations, there's a number of examples that you could think of. These include things like the U.S. Post Office. The thing about government corporations is that they run like a business, like the post office, but they have the freedom from the government to make changes to be more efficient. So they're some of the most efficient bureaucracies that will come about because they have a little bit of freedom from the government. Proxy administration consists of private parties that perform government tasks through contracts, vouchers, grants and aid, and mandates. We see a lot of these working with the U.S. Military for goods and services. We have government-sponsored enterprises, or GSEs. They're federal agencies that operated as though they were privately owned and operated. We're also going to see independent regulatory agencies. These are things like the EPA and the FCC. These are things that regulate any number of things. The FCC regulates communications. The EPA regulates environmental policy. Bureaucratic agencies seek external support in order to wield more power. They try to shape positive public opinion of their agencies. They also try to build good relation with the president and Congress to get more support. Bureaucrats' expertise in their areas give them great direction in implementing, or great discretion in implementing public policies. And again, I kind of want to reiterate that when people get into the bureaucratic structure as civil servants, they tend to serve for a lifetime term. Politicians and political appointees, if their president leaves office, they may be tempted to leave the bureaucracy. I'm not sure why, but civil servants tend to enjoy or stay in the bureaucracy way longer than anyone who's officially politically aligned. Good leaders in our bureaucracy can translate the agency's resource into political power if needed, and that can be really important when it comes to influencing Congress or the president, especially if your specific party line or ideas are out of favor. The Constitution itself empowers Congress to create, abolish, or alter bureaucratic agencies and organizations. Congress has the ability to write laws that give bureaucrats little room for interpretation when they're writing policy. They can also use the power of money to control bureaucratic authority as well. They can pull money from something like the EPA, and that would threaten them into changing their policy. Remember, we watched a film earlier this semester about the carrot versus the stick. So incentives versus punishment or taking money away. They can monitor activities using their oversight function. So if they put through legislation and they send policy to a specific place, there's usually a caveat written in there that says we can oversee how this is taken care of and make sure that it's done properly. Congressional review also allows Congress to strike down any new agency rule if both houses and the president agree. So they have power over the bureaucracy. It's not just completely freestanding. All right, moving on. When it comes, again, to controlling bureaucratic power, the president has a number of ways that they can control the bureaucracy. Senior executive service, it allows the president to reassign career civil servants if needed to other agencies. They can submit bureaucratic reorganization plans to Congress. They can control through power of appointment, but again, that power of appointment is limited by Senate confirmation. They can fire political appointees, but again, it's very, very difficult to do because they tend to have kind of a tenure system going on so that not just every president, if they don't agree with the partisan alignment of the bureaucrat, can just fire them. They can also use budget as a tool of administrative control, even though the president doesn't set forth exactly what happens to the budget. If they cut money, they know what programs it's going to come from, or they could even suggest when Congress is going over the budget, hey, cut money from the EPA because they're not doing what either of us want them to do. So when we're talking about bureaucracy and our engagement as citizens today, we have increased our interactions with the government, including bureaucracy. Again, we have encounters with the bureaucratic structure almost every single day. The DMV, the post office, any number of things. Even the FCC, when we think about that as a bureaucratic agency. Who watches television? Who reads the newspaper? Who listens to the radio every day? All of these communications, in one way or another, are somehow regulated, and that is all done by bureaucratic structures. So something I would like you guys to discuss as we get to the end of our lecture, among everybody, because this is going to be something kind of close to home. I want you to think, should the federal government forgive debt on student loans? I want you to think of this in a couple ways. I want you to play devil's advocate, if you will. Now, all of us have student loans of one kind or another. What would happen on both sides? So, what would happen to us if all of our student loans were forgiven? But what would happen to the government if all the students' loans were given? Or what would happen to the economy if all of a sudden student loans were forgiven? I want you to look at this from both sides, from people who would argue no, it shouldn't happen, or people who would argue yes. What would you want to be some of the stipulations in legislation about forgiveness of student loans? Legislation just can't say, we're going to forgive everybody's student loans, okay? Because somebody's going to argue, well, what about the people who have already paid off their student loans? Can we get reimbursement? Or what about the people who just keep going to school so they don't have to work? Or what about the people who, have way too much debt racked up? There's going to be a number of stipulations that the government would have to make whenever they would make legislation like this. And I want you guys to have a genuine discussion for a little while about how this legislation could go about, what bureaucratic structure we could create to deal with student loans. Because what are we going to do about future student loans? Are we going to make college free? How would we do that? Where do we get the money? Think about that when you're thinking about bureaucracy. All right, I will see you guys next time for Lesson 13.